The morning of March 17, 1945, the island of Iwo Jima, Private First Class William Hooper crouched behind a ridge of volcanic rock, his hands trembling as he gripped the nozzle of an M2 flamethrower. Below him, carved into the base of a cliff face, sat a concrete bunker built by Japanese engineers. 3 feet of reinforced concrete, steel-reinforced doors, firing ports no wider than a man's forearm, the kind of fortification that could absorb direct hits from naval artillery and keep fighting. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Hooper had watched 3 squads try to take that position. Machine gun fire had cut them down before they reached 20 yards. Grenades bounced off the concrete like pebbles. Satchel charges detonated harmlessly against walls designed to withstand tons of pressure. The bunker remained operational, its defenders invisible, its guns still sweeping the approach with methodical bursts. What the Japanese commanders inside that bunker didn't know, what they couldn't have anticipated when they designed these fortifications months earlier, was that Hooper carried something new, something that would fundamentally change the mathematics of bunker warfare. Inside, the tanks strapped to his back was a substance that burned at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, a gel that stuck to whatever it touched and consumed oxygen faster than men could breathe. It was called napalm, and in the next 60 seconds, it would teach the defenders of Iwo Jima that concrete walls were no longer enough. The story of napalm begins not on a battlefield, but in a basement laboratory at Harvard University. In the winter of 1942, Professor Louis Fieser, a renowned organic chemist, had been pulled away from his normal research into blood-clotting agents and vitamin synthesis. The United States government had given him a problem that seemed simple on paper, but had frustrated military engineers for years. They needed a better way to burn things. Traditional incendiary weapons used gasoline, but gasoline had fatal flaws. When sprayed from a flamethrower, it turned into a blooming fireball that dissipated almost immediately. Most of the fuel burned uselessly in mid-air. The effective range rarely exceeded 15 yards. Worse, gasoline splashed and drained too easily. Spray it at a bunker entrance and it would run off before igniting, or burn out in seconds. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Japanese capture of rubber plantations in Malaya, Indonesia, Vietnam and Thailand in 1941 had made the problem even more urgent. Earlier attempts to thicken gasoline used latex derived from natural rubber. That supply was now cut off. The Allies needed a synthetic alternative, and they needed it immediately. Fieser assembled a small team in the Converse Chemistry Laboratory on Oxford Street in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The project was classified. His own wife, Mary, who collaborated with him on most of his research, was kept in the dark for weeks until a visiting military officer accidentally mentioned the work. For months, Fieser and his assistants experimented with different combinations of chemicals, searching for something that would turn liquid gasoline into a sticky, slow-burning gel. On Valentine's Day, 1942, they found it. By mixing aluminum salts of naphthenic acid and palmitic acid with gasoline, they created a powder that could be stirred into fuel at room temperature. First, it turned into a mixture with the consistency of applesauce. Then, after sitting briefly, it transformed into a thick, tough gel. Fieser called it napalm, combining the names of its 2 key chemical components. The first test came on July 4, 1942, on the Harvard soccer field near the business school, across the Charles River in Alston. University workers had dug a circular pool 60 feet in diameter. Firefighters from Cambridge filled it with shallow water. In the center, on a metal stand, Fieser and his team placed a 70-pound bomb containing white phosphorus and 45 pounds of jellied gasoline. When Fieser flipped the switch, witnesses described what happened next as spectacular. A billowing cloud of flame rose over the field, reaching temperatures of 2100 degrees Fahrenheit. The napalm didn't explode outward like gasoline. Instead, it projected in a tight, dark-colored stream, spreading methodically across the water's surface. adhering to everything it touched, burning with an intensity that made watchers shield their faces from hundreds of feet away. Napalm bombs had arrived in the world. But the substance's true value wasn't immediately obvious to military planners. They saw it primarily as a tool for firebombing cities. The jellied gasoline could be packed into bombshells and dropped from aircraft over enemy urban areas. Because it stuck to surfaces and burned longer than regular gasoline, it was devastatingly effective against wooden structures. Tests at Jefferson Proving Ground in Indiana and later at WWII Proving Ground in Utah, where engineers built replica German and Japanese villages, confirmed that napalm could create firestorms that consumed entire city blocks. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan would eventually use napalm to horrifying effect. On the night of March 9, 1945, more than 300 B-29 superfortresses struck Tokyo with napalm incendiary bombs, creating an inferno that killed over 87,000 people in a single night. More Japanese civilians would die from napalm attacks on 64 cities than from the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. But there was another use for napalm, one that emerged from the desperate fighting in the Pacific Islands. And it was this tactical use, in the hands of combat engineers and marine riflemen, that would prove decisive against the most sophisticated fortifications the Japanese could build. By 1944, the nature of Pacific warfare had fundamentally changed. The early island campaigns, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, had taught both sides brutal lessons. The Japanese had initially defended beaches aggressively, meeting American landing forces at the waterline with massed infantry counterattacks. This doctrine, emphasizing offensive spirit and close combat, had been effective in China and during the early months of the war. But against American firepower, naval bombardment and close air support, these tactics resulted in catastrophic casualties with little gain. Japanese commanders learned. On islands like Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, they abandoned beach defenses almost entirely. Instead, they went underground. They built fortifications that represented some of the most sophisticated defensive engineering of the entire war. Networks of reinforced concrete bunkers, connected by miles of underground tunnels, artillery emplacements and machine gun nests protected by walls 3, 4, sometimes 5 feet thick. Natural limestone caves expanded and interconnected, with steel doors installed at entrances. The strategy was defense in depth. Let the Americans land unopposed. Allow them to move inland, where every ridge, every hill, every cave entrance became a killing ground. Japanese doctrine emphasized making the invaders pay such a high price for every yard that American will to continue the war would collapse. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, commander of Iwo Jima's defenses, refined this approach to perfection. Given command of the island in May 1944, he had nearly a year to prepare. His engineers transformed the 8-square-mile volcanic island into a Preiser fortress. They carved more than 11 miles of tunnels through volcanic rock. They positioned weapons to create overlapping fields of fire. They built bunkers with concrete roofs 10 feet thick. They camouflaged everything so effectively that American intelligence consistently underestimated the strength of Japanese defenses. Most importantly, Kuribayashi strictly forbade the traditional banzai charges that had wasted Japanese lives in previous battles. There would be no suicidal human wave attacks. Every soldier would fight from prepared positions, making Americans pay for every position with maximum American casualties. The defensive concept was sound. Concrete bunkers were nearly impervious to conventional weapons. Naval gunfire, even from battleships firing 14-inch shells, often failed to penetrate properly constructed fortifications. The pre-invasion bombardment of Iwo Jima was the most intense in Pacific War history. For 74 straight days, American ships and aircraft pounded the island. On February 19, 1945, the morning of the invasion, warships delivered another massive bombardment. Rockets screamed from landing craft. Aircraft dropped conventional bombs and strafed defensive positions. It accomplished almost nothing. The Japanese were so well protected that the bombardment, which should have devastated the defenses, left them virtually intact. When Marines landed, They found the fortifications operational, the defenders waiting, and the killing grounds prepared. Standard infantry tactics didn't work. Rifle fire was useless against concrete. Grenades bounced off walls or detonated harmlessly. Satchel charges, packs of explosives that infantry could throw or place, sometimes damaged bunkers but rarely destroyed them. And the interconnected tunnel system meant that even when Americans cleared a position, Japanese soldiers could reoccupy it through underground passages. Mortars proved marginally more effective. 81mm mortar shells were heavy enough to sometimes penetrate bunker roofs. But mortar fire was indirect, difficult to aim precisely, and consumed enormous amounts of ammunition. For every bunker destroyed by mortars, dozens more remained operational. The Japanese had bet everything on the strength of their fortifications. They believed, with considerable justification, that American forces lacked weapons capable of destroying properly built concrete bunkers. Their defensive manuals emphasized that American infantry, while equipped with excellent long-range firepower, was weak in close assault. They expected Americans to batter themselves bloody against prepared defenses, take unsustainable casualties, and eventually negotiate a peace that would leave Japan's home islands secure. What they didn't anticipate was that American forces had brought something new to the Pacific, something that rendered concrete walls nearly irrelevant. The M1 flamethrower, America's first portable flamethrower issued in 1942, was a disaster. It used simple gasoline as fuel. The ignition system was unreliable. The pressurized tanks were prone to leaks. Most critically, its effective range was barely 15 yards. Troops hated it. Flamethrower operators had high casualty rates because they had to get suicidally close to enemy positions, and the weapon often failed at the worst possible moment. The M1A1, introduced in early 1943, was better. It used a thickened fuel mixture that extended range to about 25 yards, but it was still heavy, 68 pounds when fully loaded, and the ignition remained unreliable. More importantly, the early fuel mixtures were inconsistent. Sometimes they burned properly, sometimes they didn't. In combat, that unpredictability could be fatal. Then, in early 1944, the Chemical Warfare Service standardized napalm as the fuel for American flamethrowers. The difference was transformative. Napalm tripled the effective range of flamethrowers. The M2 flamethrower, introduced in the summer of 1944, could project napalm out to 40 yards. More importantly, the fuel didn't dissipate in mid-air like gasoline. It traveled in a tight, coherent stream, a dark jet of jellied fire that operators could aim precisely at doorways, windows, bunker firing ports, and ventilation openings. When napalm hit a surface, it stuck. If you sprayed it at a concrete wall, it adhered and continued burning. If you directed it through a bunker firing port, it flowed inside like liquid, then ignited, transforming the interior into an inferno. The gel clung to everything it touched: walls, equipment, human skin. And it burned hot, temperatures ranging from 1470 to 2190 degrees Fahrenheit. But temperature alone didn't explain napalm's effectiveness against bunkers. The real lethality came from what happened in enclosed spaces. Napalm consumed oxygen with terrifying speed. In a confined area like a bunker or cave, the combustion rapidly depleted available air. Defenders couldn't breathe. They suffocated even if they weren't directly in the flame's path. Simultaneously, the burning napalm generated enormous quantities of carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide. These gases are heavier than air. They sank to floor level, precisely where defenders would be crouched. Even brief exposure caused loss of consciousness. Longer exposure meant death by carbon monoxide poisoning. The heat itself was lethal in enclosed spaces. Concrete is an excellent conductor of thermal energy. When napalm burned against a bunker's exterior walls, the heat transferred through the concrete. Interior temperatures rose rapidly, sometimes reaching levels that caused hypothermia and dehydration in minutes. Defenders found themselves baked alive inside their supposedly impenetrable fortifications. Research conducted during the war by Arthur D. Little, Incorporated, demonstrated these. effects with disturbing precision. Engineers built replica bunkers modeled after German defensive designs. They divided interiors into 3 sections: the fire compartment where attack would be directed, an off compartment not directly in the flames' path, and a door compartment near the entrance. Then they used M2 flamethrowers to deliver 1-gallon napalm attacks and observed the results. Test subjects, in this case laboratory animals used as proxies, showed that burn injuries were worst in the fire compartment, as expected. But the crucial finding was that respiratory damage was essentially uniform throughout the bunker, regardless of position. Subjects in the door compartment, nowhere near the actual flames, still suffered from pulmonary edema, pulmonary hemorrhage, and lung tissue damage from smoke inhalation and oxygen depletion. The bunker itself, designed to protect defenders, had become a death trap. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. On Iwo Jima, these principles translated into brutal tactical reality. Marines and Army combat engineers developed specific techniques for using napalm against fortifications. Approach routes were carefully planned to minimize exposure to Japanese fire. Flamethrower operators, heavily burdened with their 70-pound weapons, were covered by rifle squads that suppressed enemy firing ports. The assault teams worked in close coordination. Riflemen would fire into bunker openings to force defenders down, then the flamethrower would advance and deliver the killing blow. The technique was methodical. Operators didn't just spray napalm randomly. They aimed for specific points: ventilation shafts, firing ports, doorways, any opening that gave access to the interior. A single burst of napalm, lasting just a few seconds, could be sufficient. The jellied fuel would flow inside, ignite, and do its work. Marines learned to wait after each application, giving the fire time to consume oxygen and fill the space with toxic gases. For cave systems and deep tunnels, they developed even more sophisticated approaches. Sometimes they would deliberately aim the flamethrower at the cave mouth and let napalm splash off walls. The burning gel would ricochet inside, creating a storm of fire that made the entire interior untenable. Other times, they used what became known as sealed attacks. They would spray napalm inside a cave or tunnel, then immediately seal the entrance with demolition charges or bulldozers. The fire would burn until it consumed all available oxygen, suffocating anyone inside. The psychological effect was as devastating as the physical. Japanese soldiers, trained to endure artillery and rifle fire, found napalm uniquely terrifying. It couldn't be stopped by cover, it couldn't be dodged, it flowed like liquid into any space, and it burned with an intensity that defied description. Survivors spoke of watching comrades ignite, the gel sticking to skin and burning down to bone, the screams, the smell. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So, if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. By the end of the battle for Iwo Jima, more than 10,000 gallons of napalm were being used every single day. Flamethrowers had become the primary assault weapon for reducing fortified positions, and the Japanese defensive strategy, built around the assumed invulnerability of concrete bunkers, had collapsed. The statistics from Iwo Jima told the story. Of the 21,000 Japanese defenders, only about 216 were captured alive. The rest died in their fortifications. Marine casualties were staggering: 6,821 killed, 19,217 wounded. But military analysts concluded that without flamethrowers and napalm, casualties would have been far worse, possibly making the island impossible to capture at acceptable cost. The pattern, repeated on Okinawa from April through June 1945, Japanese forces there had built even more extensive fortifications, anchored around the historic Shuri Castle and supported by a series of heavily defended ridge lines. Americans faced the same problem: concrete bunkers immune to conventional weapons, tunnels that allowed defenders to reoccupy cleared positions, and a doctrine that made every yard of advance cost blood. Once again, napalm provided the answer. Tank-mounted flamethrowers, M4 Sherman tanks modified to carry 700-gallon fuel tanks, could project napalm streams exceeding 100 yards. These flame tanks worked in concert with infantry flamethrower teams to systematically reduce Japanese positions. On Okinawa, American forces used more than 200,000 gallons of napalm against defensive positions among cliffs, hills, and caves. The effectiveness was undeniable. A single flame tank could accomplish what hours of artillery bombardment couldn't. It could burn defenders out of caves, neutralize bunkers, and clear areas that would have required weeks of infantry assault. Combat reports repeatedly noted the same phrase. After a couple of bursts from the flamethrower, no further resistance or activity was encountered from that position. The Japanese had built their defensive philosophy around a fundamental assumption that American infantry, dependent on firepower and technology, would falter when forced into close combat against fortified positions. This belief wasn't baseless. It came from years of experience fighting Chinese forces, from victories in Singapore and the Philippines, from studying Western military doctrine. Japanese training manuals explicitly stated that Americans were weak in hand-to-hand combat, that they relied excessively on artillery and air support, that their infantry lacked the spiritual strength to endure protracted attritional warfare. The concrete bunkers were supposed to validate this assumption. They were engineering solutions to a tactical problem. If Americans had superior firepower, the Japanese would build defenses that firepower couldn't penetrate. If Americans relied on technology, the Japanese would create situations where technology provided no advantage. The fortifications on Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and other late-war island bastions represented the culmination of this thinking. But the Japanese had miscalculated in a fundamental way. They had assumed that technology meant artillery and aircraft, that American dependence on firepower meant an inability to adapt tactically. They hadn't anticipated that American forces would develop weapons specifically designed to defeat fortified positions. They hadn't imagined napalm. The moment of realization came at different times for different Japanese units, but the pattern was always the same. Defenders would be positioned in bunkers they believed impregnable. They would have survived days or weeks of bombardment. They would have beaten back conventional infantry assaults. They would have confidence in their fortifications and their strategy. Then the flamethrower teams would arrive. On Iwo Jima, in the northern sector where Kuribayashi had concentrated his strongest defenses, a particular network of bunkers and tunnels had held out for more than 3 weeks. This complex, carved into volcanic rock and reinforced with concrete, housed approximately 200 Japanese soldiers. They had machine guns positioned to cover all approaches. They had stockpiles of ammunition and supplies. Artillery fire had barely scratched the exterior. American forces had tried everything. Engineers had placed satchel charges against walls, detonating pounds of explosives that left scorch marks and small craters but didn't breach the defenses. Tanks had fired directly at firing ports from close range. The shells either ricocheted off the planned, angled concrete or penetrated so slightly that the interior positions remained operational. Infantry assaults had been massacred by interlocking fields of fire. On March 13, 1945, a Marine Combat Engineer Unit received orders to reduce the position using flamethrowers. They brought 4 M2 flamethrower teams and a flame tank for support. The assault began at dawn. The flame tank moved first, positioning itself within range but using terrain to protect its hull from direct fire. When Japanese machine guns opened up, the tank's turret swiveled and sent a stream of napalm directly into the main bunker entrance. The jellied fuel splashed against the concrete entranceway and flowed inside. Within seconds, the firing from that position stopped. The infantry flamethrower teams moved methodically from position to position. They had learned that speed wasn't necessary. Napalm did the work. One team would approach a firing port covered by riflemen. The flamethrower operator would deliver a 3 to 5 second burst, aiming carefully to send the napalm stream directly through the opening. Then they would move to the next position, while the fire did its work inside. What happened inside those bunkers, as reconstructed from survivor accounts and post-battle investigations, was methodical death. The napalm, entering through firing ports or ventilation shafts, would ignite immediately from the white phosphorus igniters in the flamethrowers' stream. The gel would splash across interior walls and floor, sticking to everything. Within seconds, multiple surfaces would be burning. The temperature inside the bunker would spike immediately. Concrete walls, designed to stop bullets and shell fragments, transmitted heat with terrifying efficiency. Men positioned near the burning napalm would be directly engulfed. Those further away would feel the radiant heat becoming unbearable within seconds. Burns to exposed skin would occur almost instantly at distances of several yards from the flames. But the burns weren't the primary killer. The oxygen depletion happened faster. Napalm's combustion consumed available air with shocking speed. In bunkers with limited ventilation, designed to be sealed against gas attacks, the oxygen content of the air would drop from 21% to single digits in under a minute. Men would gasp, struggle to breathe, lose consciousness. Their bodies would continue trying to breathe, but there was no oxygen left to inhale. Simultaneously, the carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide produced by combustion would fill the space. These heavier-than-air gases would sink to floor level, exactly where defenders would be positioned. Carbon monoxide binds to hemoglobin in blood more effectively than oxygen, causing rapid incapacitation. At the concentrations produced by burning napalm in an enclosed space, loss of consciousness occurred in under 60 seconds. Death followed shortly after. The survivors in the tunnel complex, those positioned deepest in the underground network, furthest from the initial napalm attacks, faced an impossible choice. They could remain in position, where smoke and toxic gases were seeping through connecting tunnels, where the temperature was rising to lethal levels, even hundreds of yards from the fires. Or they could attempt to escape, which meant running directly toward the American positions through tunnels filled with burning napalm and toxic smoke. Most chose to stay. They suffocated in the darkness, killed by an enemy they never saw, defeated by a weapon that rendered their elaborate fortifications meaningless. The entire operation took less than 4 hours. By late morning on March 13th, the position that had resisted for 3 weeks was silent. Engineers moved in cautiously with demolition charges to seal the tunnels permanently. When they investigated the aftermath, they found what napalm attacks typically produced: bodies showing minimal external trauma, in positions far from direct flame exposure, deaths caused by asphyxiation and carbon monoxide poisoning. The bunkers themselves were largely intact structurally. The concrete hadn't failed. The defenders had simply been consumed by the environment inside their own fortifications. This pattern repeated across Iwo Jima. Japanese positions that should have required days of fighting to reduce were cleared in hours. Bunkers that conventional weapons couldn't damage were neutralized by directed flamethrower attacks. The entire Japanese defensive strategy, predicated on the invulnerability of prepared positions, collapsed not because the Americans brought overwhelming firepower, but because they brought the right weapon for the specific problem. The irony wasn't lost on Japanese survivors. They had prepared for artillery. They had built fortifications to withstand naval bombardment. They had positioned forces to repel infantry assault, but they had no counter to napalm. There was no defensive technique, no tactical adjustment that could negate a weapon that flowed like water, burned hotter than any conventional incendiary, and killed through oxygen depletion as much as through flame. Some Japanese units attempted to adapt. They tried installing additional ventilation in bunkers, hoping that better air circulation would reduce the effectiveness of napalm attacks. But more ventilation meant more openings, more access points for flamethrower teams to exploit. They experimented with crude gas masks and breathing apparatus, but these provided no protection against the heat and were quickly overwhelmed by the carbon monoxide concentrations produced by burning napalm. A few units attempted the desperate tactic of launching immediate counterattacks whenever flamethrower teams approached, trying to kill the operators before they could deploy their weapons. This occasionally worked. Flamethrower operators had high casualty rates throughout the Pacific campaign, but the Americans, adapted by increasing the covering fire, by using suppressive fire from automatic weapons to keep Japanese defenders pinned while flamethrower teams maneuvered. And unlike the Japanese, who couldn't replace their losses, American forces had seemingly unlimited reserves of both personnel and napalm. The psychological impact on Japanese defenders was profound and crippling. Artillery you could endure. You dug deeper, built thicker walls, waited out the bombardment. Rifle fire you could counter. You returned fire from protected positions, used your prepared fields of fire. But napalm was different. It was intimate, unavoidable, and utterly terrifying. Japanese soldiers began describing flamethrower attacks in terms that revealed their fear. They called the weapon the liquid fire devil. Survivors spoke of watching the dark stream of napalm come through firing ports, of the sudden ignition, of trying to scrape the burning gel off skin or equipment and finding it impossible to remove. They described the sound of comrades screaming as they burned, the smell of burning flesh, the way the fire seemed alive, seeking them out even when they tried to hide in the furthest recesses of their positions. This fear manifested in changing behavior. In earlier battles, Japanese units would defend positions until literally the last man. On Iwo Jima and Okinawa, when facing flamethrower attacks, defenders increasingly chose to abandon positions rather than die by fire. Americans reported instances of Japanese soldiers rushing out of bunkers in surrender, hands raised, screaming, rather than face napalm. This was unprecedented. The same soldiers who had fought to the death against conventional weapons broke and ran when flamethrowers appeared. Of course, for many, surrender came too late. The Marines had learned through bitter experience not to accept surrenders too quickly, as Japanese soldiers had used false surrenders to launch surprise attacks with grenades or swords. By the time defenders emerged from bunkers attacked with napalm, they were often so badly burned or suffering such severe respiratory damage that they died within hours despite medical treatment. The statistical impact on fortress warfare was stark. Pre-napalm, the average time to reduce a fortified Japanese position on Tarawa or Peleliu was measured in days. A single concrete bunker might require hundreds of rounds of artillery ammunition, multiple tank gun attacks, and repeated infantry assaults before being neutralized. Post-napalm, the same positions fell in hours. The expenditure of ammunition decreased dramatically. Casualties among assault forces, while still heavy, were significantly lower than they would have been using conventional tactics. Military analysts after the war conducted detailed studies comparing the effectiveness of different weapons against fortified positions. The conclusions were unambiguous. High explosive shells were ineffective unless they achieved direct hits on weak points, which was rare. Grenades and satchel charges were too small to penetrate thick concrete. Tank guns could damage fortifications but rarely destroyed them completely. Only flamethrowers, using napalm, consistently and reliably neutralized Japanese bunkers and cave positions. The broader implications reshaped American planning for the invasion of the Japanese home islands. Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan scheduled for November 1945, was expected to be the bloodiest campaign of the entire war. Japanese forces would be fighting on their own soil. They would have millions of troops, including civilians formed into militia units. And they would have fortified the entire coastline with bunkers, tunnels, and defensive positions that made Iwo Jima look small by comparison. Military planners knew they would need napalm and enormous quantities of it. Production was scaled up dramatically. By mid-1945, American factories were producing napalm at rates that would have supported dropping hundreds of thousands of tons on Japanese defenses. Flamethrower teams were being trained in unprecedented numbers. New variants were being developed, including improved flame tanks and even flamethrower-equipped landing craft that could burn defenders off beaches during amphibious assaults. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 ended the war before Operation Downfall became necessary. Those bombs receive most of the historical attention, the recognition as the weapons that ended the war. But napalm, in many ways, had already proven the essential point. Japan's defensive strategy had failed. Their fortifications couldn't protect them. American forces had developed weapons and tactics that made the defense of the home islands untenable. The legacy of napalm in bunker warfare extended far beyond World War II. In Korea, from 1950 to 1953, American and United Nations forces used napalm extensively against Chinese and North Korean fortified positions. The weapon proved just as effective against communist bunkers as it had been against Japanese fortifications. The Korean War saw approximately 29,000 tons of napalm deployed, nearly double what was used in the Pacific Campaign. In Vietnam, napalm became infamous, its use against villages and civilian areas generating international condemnation. But militarily, it continued to serve the same purpose it had in World War II, clearing fortified positions. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army built elaborate tunnel complexes and bunker systems throughout South Vietnam. American forces used napalm, delivered both by flamethrowers and by air-dropped bombs, to neutralize these positions. The total napalm used in Vietnam, approximately 388,000 tons, dwarfed World War II usage. The weapon's effectiveness against fortifications influenced military architecture. After World War II, bunker design shifted significantly. Ventilation systems became more sophisticated, with filtration and the ability to seal completely in chemical or incendiary attack. Multiple exits became standard, allowing defenders to escape if one entrance was compromised. Improved fire suppression systems were installed. Essentially, late 20th century bunker design was a direct response to the lessons learned from napalm attacks in the Pacific. International law eventually attempted to regulate napalm's use. In 1980, the United Nations Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons included Protocol 3, which specifically addressed incendiary weapons. The protocol prohibited using incendiaries against civilian concentrations and restricted their deployment near civilian areas. Most major military powers signed the agreement, though notably, the United States did not ratify Protocol 3 until 2009, and even then with significant reservations. For the men who used flamethrowers in the Pacific, the weapon remained controversial throughout their lives. Some, like Marine Corporal Herschel Woody Williams, who received the Medal of Honor for his actions with a flamethrower on Iwo Jima, spoke of the weapon as a necessary tool that saved American lives by quickly neutralizing enemy positions. Others struggled with the memory of what napalm did to human beings, the sounds and smells of men burning alive, the knowledge that they had delivered that death personally, at close range. The Japanese, for their part, never forgot. Post-war Japanese accounts of the Pacific fighting consistently identify flamethrowers as among the most terrifying weapons they faced. Veterans describe the helplessness of being inside concrete bunkers they had believed invincible, watching the dark stream of napalm come through firing ports, knowing that within seconds the interior would become an inferno, and there was absolutely nothing they could do to prevent it. The strategic lesson was clear and brutal. Fortifications, no matter how well built, are only as effective as the weapons available to attack them. The Japanese had designed their bunkers to withstand 1940s-era artillery and naval gunfire. They succeeded brilliantly at that. But they hadn't anticipated a weapon that didn't need to penetrate concrete, that worked by flowing through openings and consuming the air inside. Their engineering was superb. Their assumptions about the nature of the threat were fatally wrong. In the final analysis, napalm in bunker warfare represented something fundamental about modern military conflict. Technology doesn't just amplify existing capabilities, it creates entirely new possibilities. The Japanese defensive strategy wasn't defeated by American forces having more artillery or more troops, though they had both. It was defeated by American forces developing a weapon specifically designed to exploit the one vulnerability that concrete bunkers inevitably possessed. They were enclosed spaces, with limited ventilation, and anything that entered those spaces could render them uninhabitable. Private First Class William Hooper, the Marine flamethrower operator we met at the beginning, survived Iwo Jima. He went on to fight on Okinawa, where he used his flamethrower against dozens more Japanese positions. After the war, he rarely spoke about his experiences. When asked, He would say only that the flamethrower was the weapon that won the island battles, that saved American lives, but that he wished he'd never had to use it. In his footlocker, stored away and never shown to his family, he kept a photograph taken on Iwo Jima. It shows a concrete bunker, walls blackened by fire, the entrance gaping open. There are no bodies visible in the photo. The Japanese defenders had been buried by engineers clearing the battlefield, but Hooper knew they were there when the photo was taken. He'd been the one who attacked that position. He'd watched the napalm stream flow through the firing port. He'd waited the required 3 minutes while the fire burned inside, and then he'd moved on to the next bunker, the next target, the next application of the weapon that Japanese commanders never expected could burn through concrete fortifications in minutes. The war ended. The bunkers remain, scattered across Pacific islands, tourist attractions now, historical sites. The Japanese defenders are buried there, thousands of them, killed by a weapon they hadn't imagined when they designed their fortifications. And the lesson remains, stark and clear. The most elaborate defenses are meaningless if your enemy brings the right weapon to the fight. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.